Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and welcome to a new month and a new year here on Patreon. I'm so excited to be launching our brand new theme called the Charm Artist Collective. So this is all about creative, bohemian, free-spirited community vibes, and you are all a part of this artist collective. And I can't wait to show you what we're going to bring you over the year. It's going to be so much fun. But to start with a bang, we are bringing you the Joan Wiggle Dress. And because this is a very special month, I wanted to bring you a little bit more than we normally do. And so we have this amazing wiggle dress for you with two different neckline options. So they're very different from each other. You have your slash neckline, which is what I'm wearing now, high neckline, cut on short sleeve. This is based on a dress that Joan wore on Mad Men, by the way. So we have the center front seam, really fun stripe placement on this. We get a chevron here, and then the dart placement gives you these horizontal stripes at the bottom of the bust section. So it's really fun. And this one is great for like wearing to the office, a little more modest, wear it to school. And then as a complete contrast to this one, we wanted to bring you something very smoldering, very sultry. So we have our sweetheart neckline, which you can see in these fabulous olive sequins behind me, which is a little bit off the shoulder, and it has a gathered sweetheart bust line and a 3/4 raglan style sleeve. And that one I'm going to show you how to make two different ways, with a fully lined bodice or with an unlined bodice. So I'm going to give you a few different finishing options today as we go through the skills. And then the skirt is a really classic 50s pencil skirt shape with princess seams in the front and the back. The great thing about this dress is that parts of it are very, very beginner friendly. And I would say if you're an advanced beginner, you can definitely handle this project. There's no zipper, it's made with stretch, and there's some easier finishing options on this as well. So if you're just getting started, maybe start with a ponte version unlined and save the sequins for your more advanced versions. So you can do a lot with this dress. You can color block it, you can do the stripes, and you can also make it as a top. So we gave you a hip length cutting line on the pattern. So if you're not into pencil dresses for whatever reason, make it into a top and you can pair it with jeans, capri pants, pencil skirts, full skirts, whatever, but it's like a really great staple. And I hope you love this dress as much as we do. I'm super excited to get into sewing two new versions of this dress because I just want this dress to be my entire wardrobe this year. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's take a look at the pattern pieces scaled down to a manageable size here for us to look at together. So these four pieces are the skirt pieces. So it's a 4-panel slim skirt that goes up to the under bust line. This is your center front piece, which is cut on the fold, side front, side back, and then your center back also cut on the fold. Now you'll see a cutting line here, and that's if you want to make the top length version. Otherwise, you're going to be cutting at the skirt length. Okay, let's look at the two different options for the neckline. These two pieces are the slash neck bodice. Okay, so this is the front. It looks a little unusual because of the dart and the cut on facing for the slash neck. The cool thing about this is when you close the dart, it creates a straight center front seam. And we're going to talk next about how to cut stripes with this piece. But I do want you to take a look at this cut on facing and what the neckline looks like. A slash neck, by its nature, has to be a straight line, all right? So it's kind of a high neckline with just a straight across cut. And because it's so straight, you're able to have a cut on facing, which makes it really easy to finish. But that's what this pointy piece is right here. And we'll talk more about interfacing that and all of that in upcoming scenes. But that's the cut on facing that just gets turned into the inside of the neckline. And then same thing on the slash neck bodice back. You can see that cut on facing. This piece, however, is cut on the fold, whereas the front you cut two of. And we'll talk about cutting that in a little bit. These are your cut on sleeves. I know you guys are going to ask, can I make the sleeves longer? And yes, you could just extend those to whatever length and width that you wished. Okay, so let's take a look at the sweetheart neckline. These are the 3 pieces for that option. You have your bodice front. This is the center front neckline, and there are 2 dots here for gathering. You gather between there, and that gets scrunched down to create that cool gathered effect at center front. This is your armhole with the single notch. This is your sweetheart bodice back. This is cut on the fold where the front is cut to, yet again with a center front seam. Your armhole here with the double notch. And these do not have a cut on facing because you are either going to finish it by just turning in that seam allowance and top stitching, or I'm going to show you how to line it today and give you a technique for finishing that upper edge with elastic to give it some really nice stability and grip. And then this piece has a raglan style sleeve. If you've ever sewn our Rita blouse, you'll recognize, or even our Bryant gown, you'll recognize the shape of this. So this is the upper edge of the sleeve, which forms a continuous line with the bodice pieces, right? And kind of goes off the shoulder there. And here's your single front notch to go to the front piece, double notch to go to the back piece at the armhole. And you can see that this is a 3/4 length, but again, you can make this shorter if you wish, or you could even make it longer if you want it to go all the way to the wrist. So those are your pattern pieces. And next we are going to talk about your supplies, and then we'll do a little talk about cutting stripes. Okay, let's talk supplies. So first of all, fabrics. This dress was intended for stretch knits. We used a lot of ponte, we used stretch velvet, we used sequins. But as I said in the intro, if you're a beginner, the ponte is a great choice. It's an easy sew knit, it's more stable. And we're recommending a stretch percentage of around 50%. A little less or a little more is fine. Just keep in mind that that may mean that you need to change the fit, particularly of the skirt. You might want to take it in if your fabric has more stretch, or let the seams out if your fabric has less stretch. So just keep in mind that the stretch percentage does affect the fit. So if you want to know how to get the stretch percentage on your fabric, what I do is I will take 2 inches across the stretchiest part of the fabric. So some, you can see on this fabric, doesn't stretch that much this way, it stretches quite a bit in the other direction. So this is the direction that's going to go around your body. So you want to take about 2 inches, exactly 2 inches relaxed of this fabric, and then stretch it as far as it will go. Mine goes to 3 inches, so that means it's stretched 1 inch, and 1 inch is half of 2 inches, so that means that this has 50% stretch. So that is how you attain your stretch percentage. And all of our fabrics have around 50%. As I said, some have a little bit more, some have a little bit less. But like particularly the sequins had a little bit more, and I ended up taking in the skirt side seams on that dress. So just know that you can work with different stretch amounts. You just might have to change the fit. So try it on as you're sewing and then see if you need to make any adjustments. So different fabrics. This is a stripe ponte, and this works great for the slash neck, doing that really cool stripe manipulation effect that I did on the slash neck version to get that chevron shape. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but these stripes are great for that. Also look great on the sweetheart neckline to do these horizontally across the sweetheart neckline. And then we really love the effect of doing stripes on top and then a solid on the bottom, so you can find a coordinating ponte knit, and we have some source recommendations for you in the instructions. And then we also used a lot of stretch velvet, you may have noticed, in the photo shoot. So again, you're looking for something with around that 50% amount of stretch. Now, I'm going to be showing you a technique for lining my pink stretch velvet dress that I'm going to be making today. So in that case, you're going to want to get a stretch knit lining, and we're going to recommend a source for that. But if you've sewn, say, our Esther swimsuit, you might already have some around your sewing room. You can use a swimsuit lining, but again, you're looking for stretch, because you don't want your lining to not stretch and your dress to stretch, right? So you want them to be compatible with each other. and to still give you that 50% stretch that you're looking for when they're layered together. Okay, so then thread-wise, you can use your regular all-purpose poly thread for this. You may need to change out your machine needle for a stretch or jersey needle. Often, especially with these thicker knits like ponte, you will get skipped stitches, and you'll see what I mean if you're doing a zigzag and then all of a sudden you have a straight little bit of stitching. That's because you skipped part of the stitch. And so you might need to change your needle to a stretch needle for that reason. Now for the slash neck specifically, you are going to want some interfacing to reinforce the cut-on facing that we talked about in the last scene. I really love, and again, we'll give you a source for this, these rolls of fusible stay tape, which are really just cut strips of interfacing that are 1.25 inches wide, so it's all ready for you to go at the correct width. But otherwise, you can just cut some strips of fusible interfacing that are 1.25 inches wide. Something lightweight like a tricot knit interfacing is a great choice for this dress. And then finally, if you are doing the sweetheart neckline and you are fully lining it, then you are going to want some sort of elastic to put in between the lining and the outer fabric, which is what I'm going to be doing on my velvet version today. Now, the recommended elastic for this type of application would be a clear elastic, 3/8 of an inch wide, because it's very, very thin. It doesn't add bulk to your neckline. But when I was sewing the samples, I ran out of this, and I found that just using 3/8 of an inch knit elastic worked great too, though it is a little bit bulkier. So just keep that in mind. You'll want enough to go around your neckline of either of those. And you will also need this fusible interfacing for the sweetheart neckline if you are not lining it. If you're just turning in that the neckline edge and zigzagging, you will need this as well. Okay, so that's all the supplies. Let's get talking about stripes. All right, so let's just talk briefly about how you would do that cool stripe chevron effect on the slash neck bodice. So here's my pattern piece. This one has gotten a little beat up and been through a bit of changes and notes and stuff, as you'll see, but this is what the shape yours is going to look like. So this is the center front, right? And then this big dart, and then the center front continues underneath the dart, okay, to get that straight line. Now, normally the grain line would be parallel to the center front up here, so you could cut it out and have like the stripes go horizontal right across the top. But after seeing that dress on Mad Men, I spent a lot of time figuring out how we can get that cool effect where the stripes are horizontal like this underneath the dart, and then you get the chevron effect at the top. And believe me, this took a few tries, but I'm very proud of where we've gotten with this. So what needs to happen is that the grain line is down here and it's parallel to center front underneath the dart. So if you're using horizontal stripes like I am, you need to make sure that this grain line, the center front, is parallel to your selvage, like exactly parallel, like this. And now you can see, if I lift this up, I'm going to get these horizontal stripes at the bottom, and the pattern is designed for you to get the chevron above the dart. So I'm just going to show you what it's going to look like after I cut this piece out. So let's just say I cut that. See how I'm getting that chevron effect here, especially when you add the other piece on the other side of the center front seam. So the work is really done for you. I just wanted to explain to you how it works. And I did want to caution you that you're going to need to cut one, all right, right side up. And then I would leave your pattern or the fabric on the back of your paper pattern piece, turn it over, and then cut the piece exactly the same following the stripes, so that the stripes on piece number 1 and piece number 2 that you're cutting match exactly. Okay, so spend a little time with that, and then it gives you a really cool effect in the end. Okay, we're ready to sew. So we're starting with the slash neck. And you can see that I have applied the interfacing 1.25 inches wide just to the cut on facing portions on the 2 center front pieces and also on the center back piece, which is cut on the fold. So it's just one piece. We didn't talk about this in the stripe segment, But I did want to mention that the stripes on the back can just go horizontally across the back. There's no chevron treatment like there is for the front, okay? So let's put the back to the side for now, and we're going to focus on sewing the center front first. So first things first, we are going to sew this big dart. So I have mine lightly marked in this pink tracing paper that I transferred with a wheel, and we're going to sew these darts. Put the legs together. And now one thing you're going to notice throughout this video is that I'm going to go back and forth between zigzag stitches and straight stitches, okay? So there are a couple different, it changes depending on if you need the seam you're sewing to stretch or not. The dart does not need to stretch, so we're going to be sewing this with a straight stitch. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Either a narrow zigzag or a straight stitch is primarily what we're going to be using. Oops, there goes a pin. All right. So there we go, and I'm ready to sew this one. And these darts you can see are really big. They had to be to get that stripe direction change that we needed on this. So maybe a little bigger than you're used to sewing. We're on a straight stitch, and I'm going to back stitch at the beginning, but not at the point. And at the point of the dart, you want to be really careful to not just go straight off the fabric at a really steep angle. What I like to do is do a few stitches that are just parallel to the fold so that it's a little easier to press and have it look nice and flat. All right, so I'm going to leave tails at the point and tie these off. And cut them close. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing on the dart on the other side, but you can already see how cool this is going to look, how the chevron is being created here, and then how we have the horizontal stripes underneath the dart. All right, so let's sew our second stripe, and then we'll talk about pressing the darts on the center front seam. Okay, so we now have 2 darts sewn, and as you can see, there is a lot of dart excess in the back. So if your fabric is really bulky, like this ponte is a little bulky, you can trim this down. So trim it down to about, a regular seam allowance, like 5/8 of an inch, and then slash kind of close to the point of the dart so that then you've reduced a lot of that bulk. Now I would say don't trim it down if you plan on doing a fitting, right? Because you may want to move the position of the dart, may need to be higher or lower, so don't do any cutting away if you think you might be changing the fit. But if you're sure of the fit of the dress, like I am at this point for me, then you can go ahead and trim this down if you want. Okay, and now we're going to press the dart open over a ham so that we can really get the curve. And then the trick with a dart like this that has so much excess is to really press the tip as flat as possible. So kind of don't stretch it over the ham, that's not the right word, but get it as smooth as possible over the ham. And then this point is where you want to be pressing it as flat as possible. Okay. So that's what you're looking for on the front. I'm going to repeat that on my other dart. Trimming away and then pressing open. so now we are good to sew our center front seam, which is very exciting because you can start to see the shape come together and the look of the stripes come together if you're using stripes. We did sew this in a solid velvet version too, and it looked really great. So don't feel like you have to do all of this with the stripes. Okay, so as you can see, my stripes look like they're going to match up, right? But I need to be very careful to make sure that they're actually going to match up when I sew them, because a lot of shifting can happen when you sew with the presser foot plus the feed dogs. There's a lot of shifting, right? So what I do is I pin every single stripe when I'm sewing stripes. I just like to have overkill. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm put these right sides together, and you're going to match at the dart first. You want those two darts to match up exactly. So I just put a pin through and make sure it's going right through at the same point. And then it looks like every dart or every stripe is going to match up. But what I like to do is I come in about 5/8 of an inch, right? So where you're going to be sewing the seam. So if it matches at the raw edge, that doesn't really help you. You need it to match at the seam line. So at about 5/8 of an inch in, you're going to put your pin through, and you want to make sure that it's matching at the same point of the stripe. So the top of the stripe exactly on both sides, okay? And I am just going to do that with the top of every stripe up this seam. So take your time with this and just really check on every single stripe. The facing, so that's a little less important, but we still want to match it. And then down below the dart, same thing. You want to make sure that those stripes are going to match each other. Okay, so now we're ready to sew this center front seam. And here you can use either a straight stitch or a zigzag. The place where I'm primarily concerned with using a zigzag is on the side seam. So you at least have one seam that's going to expand a little bit as you're wearing it. Okay, so starting at center front at the bottom. And I like to keep my, you guys know I don't like to sew over pins. I frown upon that, but when I'm sewing stripes, I may sew over them just a little bit. And I like to keep my pins in for as long as possible. So I'm just about to stitch over it and then I don't. Because otherwise, all that work that you did pinning the stripes goes away. And also you gotta make sure that your dart seam allowances stay open, which mine are not. So let me just fix that real quick. There we go. Okay, so this is where you get to check your moment of truth here, see if your stripes look how you want them to look. And let's see, I really like how my chevron looks. I'm not so happy with this below the dart, so I'm going to fix that. All you have to do if you want to fix any part of this seam is just take out the stitches where you want to fix it. Do not take out the whole seam because then you're going to undo all that work. So I'll go back off camera and I'll just take out that little bit and then just kind of repin and get those stripes right on top of each other. And then you can press this seam open. Okay, so now that my center front seam is sewn and pressed open, we are now going to sew the shoulder seams. And this is a little different on a slash neck top, so I really want to take you through the process. So you're going to grab your bodice back, which you've already interfaced the neckline on that one. You're going to put these together at these shoulder seams here. Okay, so this is the shoulder seam on the top, and this gets a little bit funky when you get into this shape here, right? Because what you need to do on a slash neck is sew the shoulder seam, and then you're going to pivot and continue your stitching to seam the facing together, the cut-on facing together here. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the whole thing. I would say it's a great idea to mark in your seam allowances so that you know where to pivot. So I find this really helpful because otherwise you get here and you're like, oh, I guess I'll pivot around here. It's really good for consistency on both sides and so that you sew the neckline the width that was intended on the pattern to mark these in. So just kind of, you know, an inch away from this inner corner here, you can use an invisible ink or disappearing ink pen to mark in the seam allowances and then turn it over so that you're now marking in the seam allowance along this edge, the slash neck cut on facing edge, and 5/8 of an inch from that raw edge, and then continuing to where those two lines meet. And now you can see it's a lot further in than you might expect. So if you were just kind of sewing along your merry way, you might go 5/8 of an inch in, but you actually need to sew and pivot to where those two seam lines meet, which is quite a bit further in than you might expect. Okay, so let's sew this one side and then I'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to switch to using a narrow zigzag at this point. So about 1.5 wide on the zigzag and then my usual 2.5 millimeters long on the length. Okay, so I'm starting at the edge of the sleeve opening. And I'm just sewing my shoulder seam as usual, nothing strange happening yet. And then I have this lovely marked line to follow. So when you get to your pivot point, you're going to stop with your needle down and flip this whole thing around and then follow your marked line. Stitching at 5/8 of an inch on this strange little pointy bit here. And then you're actually going to go off the edge when you get to it. There's going to be a little excess here that we will trim off in the next step. Okay, so that is your stitching line there. The next thing you're going to do is you are going to cut to your pivot point through both layers. Okay, so now that's open like that. Next thing we're going to do is press the shoulder seam open. Like that. And now flip it around and open up that cut on facing seam allowance here. And you're also going to press this open as well to the point where they meet here. Now, you will see I have a ton of excess here. Because of the seam allowances and the way we have to put them on the pattern, we end up having all this excess. So what you can do is just trim those off. Anywhere you're seeing the wrong side there, just trim that off. And then when you turn the cut on facing to the inside, you'll have a nice, neat finish like that. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing on the other shoulder, and then we'll talk about how to top stitch the facing in place. Okay, so I've sewn both shoulder seams, pressed them open, and now we are ready to turn the cut on facing to the inside of the dress and then we are going to top stitch it at 1 inch wide all around the neckline. Now that inch wide top stitching is kind of the look of a slash neck. You see the facing stitched down. But I will say if you sewed this in a fancy fabric, like say a crushed stretch velvet, like we had our beautiful gold sample, then you might not want to see that top stitching, in which case you can definitely hand stitch this in, just catching a thread on the inside so you don't see the hand stitching from the right side of the dress. So keep that in mind, but this is how you would typically sew a slash neck in a more casual fabric like this striped ponte. So I'm looking at the inside of the dress here. I just sewed my shoulder seams. This is my cut on facing. This is my center front seam. And this interfacing is 1.25 inches wide. So, and that's the width of my facing. So I'm going to turn the facing to the inside of the dress just at that edge of the interfacing. So you can feel it, when you turn it in. And we are going to press that cut on facing in place to the wrong side of the dress. And I'm also going to put a few pins to hold it in place. And then same thing on the back neckline. And one little tip, I just bled a little on the dress, just pricked myself a little bit. Luckily it's on the facing. One thing I will mention is that we noticed, at the photo shoot, we had 4 different models modeling this neckline. It's really high on some people and then it's a little lower on others, just depending on the length of your body from here to here. So if you feel like it's really high on your neckline, first of all, you could make the neckline a little wider just to release a little bit here. You could also just tuck in a little bit more, kind of cheat it at center front. But keep that in mind. Also a good reason to make a muslin if you're considering it. Okay, so just turning that to the inside along the edge of the facing. And then same thing at the shoulders. You're just going to want to press this in a little bit just to make sure that it's secure there. And put a pin here. Now keep in mind you're going to be stitching this from the right side, so you want to make sure that all these pins are accessible to pull out from the right side. Same thing here. You want to make sure these seam allowances stay open and flat on top of each other. Give them a little press. So hopefully you can see as I'm constructing this why it's called a slash neck. If you look at the inside here, it's really just a straight slash opening. And that gives you that, very straight high necked effect that looks really cool and very vintage. Okay. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to top stitch this at 1 inch. Now, I would recommend, I don't really like starting at the shoulder seams or at center front, so I like to start at center back and kind of overlap my stitching at center back. Also keep in mind you're going to want to use a straight stitch here. I just think it looks nicer for top stitching as opposed to the narrow zigzag. Also, you don't really need a lot of stretch in the neckline because it's big enough to get over your head. So let's put our machine back on straight stitch. And we are stitching with 1 inch seam allowance. So for me, I know that's this line on my machine. Oops, let's get this underneath there. And you're going to be catching the edge of the cut on facing underneath. And just make sure that you keep everything nice and smooth so you don't get any ripples or anything on your facing. And you're going to keep stitching at 1 inch all the way to your shoulder seam and then pivot. This might have been a good place to mark in my top stitching line if I were feeling like I had a lot of time to do that today. Keep that in mind. You may want to mark in your top stitching lines because again, it's like when we marked in those seam allowances on the cut on facing. It's a lot further in than you think. And again, just keep everything nice and smooth. Don't want any ripples in your top stitching. So I really like to hold the neckline nice and taut. And same thing again, I'm stitching at 1 inch and I'm just going to continue that stitching until I get to the shoulder seam line and then pivot and turn around to do the other side. Again, it's a lot further in towards the sleeve than you think it is. And now I'm going to connect with my top stitching from when I started and just overlap those two, back stitch, and there we go. So your neckline is finished. How easy is that with a cut-on facing? No separate pieces to cut, any of that. So here is what your top stitched facing should look like. So like I said, the top stitching is part of the look of it. You definitely want to give it a little press and steam just to remove any little ripples that you're seeing from the top stitching. And same thing on the back. And now, believe it or not, the only thing left to do to finish the upper portion of the slash neck dress is to sew the side seams. So let's put these right sides together. Now this is a very angular underarm we have going on here. This is with a cut-on sleeve. You're going to sew the bottom of the sleeve and then pivot at that corner and sew the side seam. Now this is another situation where we have two very different shapes coming together, right? So you should see that these pieces match at the 5/8 of an inch seam line. Don't worry too much about what's going on over here because you have two different angles coming together with seam allowances, but you're looking for it to match at the 5/8 of an inch seam line. And your stripes are not going to match here. I'm just telling you now, unless you cut the front a little differently than I did. But all of that work that we had to do to get that chevron shape and the stripes going in a different direction underneath the bust dart means that the stripes are not going to match at the side seam or on the sleeve or shoulder seam. And that's fine. Sometimes with stripes you just have to kind of pick your battles. All right, I'm going to sew these seams. And here I'm going to use that narrow zigzag again. Their arm. Okay, so to press these side seams open, you are going to need to clip into the underarm point where you pivoted. And a ham is very handy to have here to raise the surface a little bit. Just helps me a little bit after the seams are sewn. So press that seam open, and then you can turn the whole thing around and this gets a little tricky here, but to now press the seam under the sleeve open like this. And I am going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so your slash neck bodice is practically done except for the sleeve hems. That's later in the instructions. We always save hems for last. But if you wanted to get a little step ahead here, the way we're going to hem this is to just turn it in 5/8 of an inch and then use that narrow zigzag so it stretches at 1/2 inch all the way around the sleeve opening. And then this is ready to sew onto your skirt after you've constructed your skirt. Okay, so we are now ready to sew the sweetheart version of the bodice. So this is constructed a little bit differently. As I mentioned at the beginning, I am going to show you 2 different neckline finishes for the sweetheart version, a really simple one without a lining, and then also the fully lined version with the elastic in the top, okay? So I'll talk you through both of those, and then we're going to get to the skirt after we construct this bodice. Okay, so these are your 2 bodice front pieces for the sweetheart neckline. I'm using this delectable pink stretch velvet. So I want you to be really mindful of the direction of these pieces. It is, I can tell you from experience, very easy to get them flipped around and then you're gathering the armhole or something. So just be really careful. The armhole has the single notch on it. This is your side seam here. And then your center front will have a dot mark at the top and a dot mark at the bottom. Those are your gathering guidelines. I mean, I can tell you right now they're each 5/8 of an inch in from the edge because that's how much we're going to gather. We're going to gather it up to get that little scrunched effect at the center front bust. So let's go to the machine and we're going to do our gathering stitches at center front first. And I actually like to start at the very top edge here just so I have a little bit more to grab in terms of the tails. But you're going to want your stitch length to be at 4 or 5, and then no zigzag here. We're using a straight stitch. We're going to start stitching at the top of the center front using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to do the same thing again at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, closer to the edge here. And trim those. I'm going to repeat on the other side of center front. Okay, so now we are going to pull up our bobbin threads to create these gathers. Now, I will tell you that we're going to be giving you a gathering guide in the pattern so that you know how much you need to gather this, because we're not sewing it to another piece. We're sewing these gathered pieces to each other, right? So there's no way to distribute the gathers evenly to match a piece. So we're going to provide that piece for you. I will tell you that my preference is to just scrunch it down as far as it will go so that I get a really defined center front neckline, and it also makes it a little more low cut. So I know I've been gathering mine down to about 3 inches or less. Obviously that will change in the other sizes, and if you want more coverage, you're going to want to do less gathering. So if you don't want to show so much cleavage, then you can do a more subtle gathered effect and not pull quite so tight on those bobbin threads on the gathering. But I'm just going to go for it. And gather these up. Now you don't want to see any gathering in the seam allowances, right? So above and below those dot marks. And you also want the pieces to be the same length as each other at center front. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is put these right sides together and sew this center front seam. And very important, we're only going to sew from the upper dot down to the bottom, okay? So you, essentially what I'm saying is you want to leave 5/8 of an inch open at the center front neckline, which is gonna help us when we put the lining on to get a really clean center front V-point. Okay, so just going to pin these center fronts together. And it's gonna feel quite bulky, and that's fine. And you can just double check. Okay, so now we're gonna stitch this together. Using a straight stitch is fine here, like we did on the other center front, the slash neck. So again, just make sure you start 5/8 of an inch down using a 2.5 millimeter long stitch length and 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, because this is our seam that we're sewing here. And you can sew all the way to the bottom edge. You don't have to leave that open for 5/8 of an inch like we did at the top. Okay, and you want to just check your gathers and make sure you like how they look. And I love how they look in this pink velvet. Don't have enough pink velvet in my wardrobe. Okay, there we go. And now you can press this seam allowance open. If you like, you can trim it down to reduce some of the bulk here, but I found it was the same difference kind of to leave it long, because it's still going to be bulky no matter what because of all the gathering. So I personally preferred to just leave, oh, I have this on minimum now, whoops. Preferred to leave the full seam allowance intact, but it's obviously totally up to you to make that decision for your own garment. Okay, and that's what you're looking for on the right side, and you can trim away any excess gathering threads now. Okay, so moving right along, we are going to sew the side seams, the bodice front to the bodice back. So the back was cut on the fold, remember, so it's just one piece. So now we're going to sew these side seams. And now we're going to go back to using that narrow zigzag, because again, we're on side seams now. And we want to retain some stretch in the seam. So 1.5 on the zigzag width. Same length as I was just using, 2.5. And I'm sewing at 5/8 of an inch. Now, velvet is notoriously tricky to sew. I find these stretch velvets relatively easy. They're not like a slinky silk velvet, which is my nightmare fabric to sew. This one isn't quite so bad, but you do want to watch out for it trying to slip around. You want to make sure that these raw seam edges stay right on top of each other. What did I do? There we go. Okay, I'm going to repeat on the other side seam. Okay, you can just lightly steam those open if you want, but one thing I love about knit fabrics is you really don't have to press that much, sometimes not at all, but You can just give it a little press. With velvet, definitely don't press hard because you will crush it. And if it's not intended to be crushed, you don't want that. Okay. Here is your bodice front and back all constructed, and now we can move on to the sleeve. So super easy. I love how quickly these dresses come together. You have your 2 sleeve pieces, and we are going to sew the underarm seam on the sleeves. So you're going to put these right sides together, each piece, and pin from the top to the bottom, and sew with that narrow zigzag stitch, and then press open, and then we'll come back and we will insert the sleeves into the bodice. Okay, so I have assembled my sleeves and so press that seam open, and now we are going to sew the sleeves onto the bodice. So this is super simple. It's not like sewing a set-in sleeve. You really just take the underarm of the sleeve and the underarm on the bodice and match those right sides together. And make sure those seam allowances stay pressed open. So I like to put a pin on either side of the seam. You're matching your notches, so single notch on the sleeve to single notch on the bodice. That's how you know it's the front. And then this is your neckline. And for velvet, you know, just use a few pins so that those edges, especially when you're pinning things that are 2 different shapes together, just pin those together. You're just sewing that curve shape, the underarm here. So again, I would use that narrow zigzag, 1.5 millimeters wide by 2.5 long, starting at one end. And here we go. Okay, so I've sewn that underarm seam, setting the sleeve into the bodice, and now I'm just going to trim down these seam allowances as one, down to about 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch is good. And you don't need to press these seams open or in any direction, they're fine. So just leave unpressed. Okay, and now I'm going to repeat that on the other sleeve. So same exact process. And then we will talk about lining the bodice. Okay, so both sleeves are now sewn on, and I have a fully constructed outer bodice for the Sweetheart neckline. Now let's talk about neckline finishing. You have a couple different options, and we definitely wanted to give you 2 different options because let's say you were sewing this in something like a ponte that's very easy to finish. You don't necessarily need a lining in it. Then there is an easy finish unlined option, which I'm going to walk you through right now. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for velvet, though you could try it. What you would want to do, leave it unlined, and then you would apply fusible strips of interfacing all the way around the neckline, from center front all the way around to the other side of center front, with the edge of the fusible strips matching up to the edge of the neckline. And you would want those strips to be 1.25 inches wide, so double your seam allowance there. Okay, and then after that was fused on, all you would need to do is turn in 5/8 inch, and then you could do your narrow zigzag top stitch at 1/2 inch to hold the seam allowance in place, and then you would have a finished edge. At center front, you have that opening here, so you would just have it would look like that. Now, it's not the greatest for velvet, because fusing things to velvet doesn't work that well, because you really need to press to get it to adhere, and then you have crushed velvet, which you don't really want. So I would recommend lining velvet. But if you were doing something like the ponte, then yeah, by all means try this, and then the fusible strips will keep that neckline from stretching out of shape over time. So keep that in mind. You probably don't want to skip that step, especially in stretchier fabrics. Okay, so that's one unlined option. And if you're taking that option, you can do it and move on to the skirt. But let's talk about lining your bodice, because this is a really nice finish, especially for fancier fabrics like velvet. Also will add a layer of opacity, which will be nice for me with this lighter color of the velvet. And it gives you a really pretty finish at the neckline edge, and it gives us a place to insert some of that clear or non-clear, as we discussed in supplies, elastic, which helps the lining keep from rolling out as you're wearing it. It's a really cool trick, and I tried this neckline a couple different ways, and I was amazed at how well this works. So if you're thinking about skipping the elastic, don't do it, especially for something like the sequins or something like that where the lining can easily pop out. That elastic really helps. So I'm going to show you how to do that. But first, you're going to prep your lining. You're going to do all those steps that we did to the outer bodice to your lining. So gather your center front. You're going to gather it to the same height that you did your outer bodice. And then sew your center front seam, side seams, put those sleeves in there. Okay, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to sew the neckline. Okay, so I have sewn my bodice lining just like I did for the outer bodice. So I have an inner and outer that are ready to be put together, right sides together. So don't even worry about the elastic for now. Now we're just going to put the necklines together, right sides together. So I'm turning the lining inside out. And then we will match center front to center front, like so. And this is that point that we left open here. And sorry for all these gathering threads. Let me get rid of a few of these. We have this open 5/8 inch here. So we're going to start stitching and pinning kind of underneath this seam allowance here at center front. So you can put a pin right there. And then we're going to pin the entire neckline together. So match all those seams. Now for the shoulder seams, like the sleeve seams, I usually like to put one seam allowance going one direction and the other going the other direction, but just make sure you match the seams, and that reduces a little bit of bulk. But you know, you could press them all to one side if you prefer it that way. I like, you know, knits can be really freeing because they're not quite as finicky as wovens. So just keep it relaxed. Pin all the way around. There's the top of my sleeve. And I'm going to go to center back around the other sleeve and then continue around to the other side of the sweetheart neckline at center front. Okay, and then continuing around to the other side, just like I did with when I started pinning at the other side of center front, just get underneath that seam allowance and place a pin there. Okay, so now we are going to stitch this neckline. I use a straight stitch here. It is totally up to you. I think, you know, with the steps we're going to do next with the elastic, a straight stitch just works a little bit better. And also this is a really big neckline. You don't have to worry about it stretching. You know, you don't have to stretch it over your head or anything like that. So I'm going to use a straight stitch. And here's my center front point with all, it's like a little butterfly with all those seam allowances meeting, and I just need to get underneath, so press those seam allowances to one side, get underneath, and you're starting at the center front seam at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, make sure your seam allowances are matching here. I'm going to back stitch. And I'm going to sew all the way around at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, now I'm coming back around to the other side of center front, and I want to again get underneath all the seam allowances, so just move all the seam allowances to the other side. And then backstitch at center front. And you can just kind of check your work at center front, like kind of turn it right side out. If there's a little gap like there is on mine, I can go back and fix that, but you can see how there's no puckering or anything like that happening, which is what we're looking for. It just turns in easily and gives you a nice sweetheart point. All right, so now we are ready to apply the elastic to the neckline. And just to reiterate, the reasoning for this is, like this, it's gonna stretch out over time. It'll probably fall down your shoulders. Again, the lining might pop out. Just this one little step will give you, it's almost like a hard edge on your shoulder, and also help it grip to your body so it won't stretch out. It's almost like a stabilizer, but also it's amazing what it does for keeping the lining from rolling out over the soft edge that we have going on now. Okay, so this is super simple. You can either use the clear elastic or, like I said, just 3/8 of an inch regular knit elastic, which is what I'm going to use today because you're going to be able to see it a little bit better on camera. You don't need to pin it or anything. You just kind of keep, I have this huge roll from when we did bathing suits. So I'm just going to keep mine kind of slack off of the roll and apply it as I'm stitching it, okay? So we're going to start at center front, again, lifting up those seam allowances. And you want to be stitching from your lining side. So have the lining side facing up. And one cut edge of the elastic will be at this side of center front, and then we'll go around and finish at the other side of the sweetheart point. Okay, so what we're going to do is stitch our elastic so that it is right next to the line of stitching that we just did. Okay, so you don't want it to be overlapping that stitching. You want it to be just flush up next to it. And we're going to do a line of straight stitching on the edge of the elastic. Just pulling the elastic, stretching it ever so slightly as you're applying. You don't want to be really doing this, or then you're going to have a gathered up neckline, right? So just enough to kind of keep it gripping to your shoulders as you're wearing it. Okay, so let's get started on this. I'm going to move my giant roll over here. And I'm in a straight stitch still. 2.5 length is fine. No pins, just starting at center front here. And I'm just going to anchor that by back stitching. Okay, and now here's where I really get going. You're going to just pull the elastic ever so slightly. Oops. Let me just get this out of the way. There we go. Ever so slightly, so I'm just kind of pulling it forward like that and stitching the elastic right next to that seam line where we sewed the lining to the dress. I'm going to do this all the way around the neckline, ending at the other side of center front. Okay, so you can see I have sewn the entire elastic around the neckline. And next you can trim down these seam allowances if you like if you feel they're bulky in any particular place. Like with my sequins, I definitely had to trim away behind the seam allowances a little bit like that. So I'm going to do that on this velvet too, especially around the seam allowances, I'm sorry, where the seam lines meet. So you have, the adjoining seams. Also, this lining is pretty annoying because it keeps rolling in. So I'm going to definitely trim it down a little bit. So I'm just going to keep doing this around the entire neckline, and then we're going to come back and talk understitching. Okay, so I've trimmed down my seam allowances as desired, and now I can turn the lining in, but I'm going to understitch, okay? So I did want to walk you through this because it's a little different understitching, or it feels different. It's really the same. Understitching with elastic in your seam allowances, okay? So I'm going to start, let's start at one sleeve seam. We're going to have all of the seam allowances and the elastic oriented towards the lining, and we're going to understitch right here about an eighth of an inch, a scant eighth of an inch away from the seam line on the lining itself, grabbing all of that stuff in our stitching. Okay, so let's get started with the understitching. So I'm opening this out nice and taut. I'm using like a darker pink here so you can see it, and a straight stitch. And I'm just keeping this nice and smooth. And I'm making sure as I go that the elastic, all my seam allowances, etc., are underneath where I'm stitching, not underneath the velvet side. And you can see my understitching right there. I'm going to do this all the way around the neckline. And actually, now that I've started, I just realized it would have been smarter to start at center front, because you really need to do this in two. Now I'm gonna have to do it I'm gonna have to break my stitching at center front, because you can't just go over center front. So start on one side of center front and then go around to the other side of center front, okay? You do it the smart way, like I did not do. But the idea is the same. You're going around the entire neckline understitching. Okay, so I've understitched the entire neckline, and now you can actually put your sleeve linings inside your sleeves and like really put the two layers together here. Turn the lining all the way to the inside. And now what we're gonna do is give this a nice press. So you need to kind of roll the understitching to the wrong side and see, I mean, maybe you can't see, but once you get to this step, you'll be able to feel how there's really a nice hard edge where the elastic is, which is what is going to give it that smooth look at the neckline on the wrong side. So now you're just going to give it a nice press from the inside. And I will say that you may notice that it looks like the elastic is going to pop out towards you like this. And don't even worry about it, because we did some samples and I was looking at that thinking, oh, is that going to create a ridge, or it's going to be trying to pop out? And it laid so beautifully on all the models. So it's just one of those things, it looks a little funny while you're sewing it and you might start to worry about it, but it's really nothing to worry about, I promise. So just press this in, rolling the elastic out to the edge all the way around. And again, with any delicate fabrics like sequins or velvet or whatever, don't press down too hard, and definitely don't use super high heat on anything that's embellished like sequins, so you might melt them. Okay. So there we go. Okay, so the neckline is now finished. And the next thing we need to do, and really the last thing we need to do on this bodice, is baste these two layers together, the lining and the outer dress, together at the lower edge, these lower raw edges. Okay, so you're going to pin in place, match up those seam allowances, make sure they stay open. And we're going to pin all the way around this lower seam here, and then baste those layers together so they are now one when we go to sew them to the skirt. And you're going to do the same thing on the sleeve as well. So let me just talk about that briefly. You are going to put the sleeve all the way, the lining all the way down into the sleeve. You're going to make sure it's not twisted, right? And then match that underarm seam. Make sure your seam allowances stay open and pin those together. Okay, all the way around. Okay, so I'm going to pin and then baste lower edge, both lower sleeve edges, using a long zigzag stitch and then a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, and so then that's it for this bodice. We're ready to go into the skirt. Okay, so you have sewn your bodice and now we are ready to sew our skirts. So good news, this is the easiest part of the whole dress. You really are just sewing your 2 front princess seams. So basically assembling the skirt front, assembling the skirt back, and then sewing the front to the back at the side seams, okay? And I would use a narrow zigzag stitch on all your seams and then press them open. The most important thing is to really pay attention to your notches, okay? So I'm going to start with my center front panel, then I'm going to grab each of my side front panels, and you're looking for coordinating notches on all of these and pinning them right sides together. So if anything is off, just be really clear. Make sure you're not, pinning the side back to the center front, for example. So you just got to be really careful with that. And so I'm going to sew each side front to the center front, press the seams open, repeat the process for the back, and then sew at the side seams and press open. And then you'll have an entire skirt. 1.5 stitch width, 2.5 length. Okay, so we are on to sewing on our skirts. So whether you sewed the slash neck bodice or the slash neck or sweetheart bodice, the process is the same. You pretty much put the two together and sew them around that midriff seam. But I'm going to walk you through it, and I'm also going to talk just as a bonus about how you would line your skirt if you wanted to, okay? But first, you have your skirt fully constructed, all those seams sewn and pressed. And now we are going to put it right sides together with your bodice. And to do that, the best way to start is to turn your skirt wrong side out and then put the bodice inside the skirt and make sure you're matching front to front and back to back. Don't get those confused. Match your side seams. And just put that bodice all the way inside the skirt like that. And then we're just going to sew in the round, attaching those two. Okay, so I'm just going to take a minute to match all my seams and put a bunch of pins in here, and then we will sew this. Okay, so I have a little round here, and now I'm going to sew these together using my narrow zigzag. Okay, so I just finished sewing that midriff seam, sewing the bodice to the skirt. So with these seam allowances, you could leave them as is. I like to serge these, just kind of finish them all as one and also trim them down to about 3/8 of an inch. It just keeps them feeling more neat on the inside of the garment, but it's really up to you. You know, knits don't fray. You'll notice we haven't done any seam finishing so far, so you don't really need to worry about it, but you could trim them down, zigzag them together if you like, but you don't have to. Okay, so crazy thing is we are pretty much done with this dress now that that seam is sewn. Look how cute it's looking. So you just need to do your hems, and that's it. Your sleeves, your sleeve hems and your skirt hem. So let me just talk you through this. On your skirt hem, what I would recommend doing is, well, first of all, if you're not sure about the length, definitely try it on. We do tend to go a little longer with our pencil skirts here at Charm, just for a more vintage look, but if you're on the shorter side, then you may need to trim off a little at the bottom. So you're going to turn up the hem allowance 5/8 of an inch, press it and pin it in place. And then from the right side, you're going to do that narrow zigzag at 1/2 an inch. Okay, and I was a little worried about how this would look on the velvet, because you know, velvet doesn't really look great with top stitching, or it's known for not looking great with top stitching. But I was really surprised at how on the stretch velvet, that narrow zigzag hem looked really good. So don't worry about that if you are. And so you're going to do the hem of the skirt. You are also going to do, if you did the 3/4 sleeves and you have the lining, so what I would recommend is just turning them in together as one, right? Because they're basted together, 5/8 of an inch. So the basting is on the inside, and again, doing that narrow zigzag on the sleeve hem. Okay, so, and then if you did the slash neck bodice, same thing. You're going to turn in your hem allowance on the sleeve and do the narrow top stitch at 1/2 an inch. I did want to give you a little bonus content here on lining the skirt. We didn't line any of the skirts for the photo shoot samples, and I thought they felt great and looked great. You can always wear a slip underneath this dress, like our Sweetheart slip that we did on Patreon. I think it was last year or the year before. Would work really well. It's like exactly the right length to wear with this skirt. So you could make a slip if you don't want to go through the trouble of making and inserting a lining. But it's pretty easy to add a lining to the skirt, and I thought I would do it just so that I had color consistency from the bodice, which is lined with that light pink, to the skirt, which is now going to be a little bit sheer. So if you want to do that, you are just going to construct another skirt in your lining fabric, right, which I've done here. So cut out the same pieces, sew them the same way that you did the dress, And I've already hemmed my skirt lining, but it's the same process of just turning it up and doing the narrow zigzag at 1/2 inch. And now I'm going to turn my dress right side. Wait, I'm going to turn it wrong side out. I'm going to turn it wrong side out, and I'm going to isolate this midriff seam again. I'm just finding my center front and getting my bearings here. Okay, and then I'm going to grab my lining. And now I'm going to take the lining and I'm going to put it inside the bodice, right sides together with the bodice lining, okay? And now, so now I have like a 3-layer sandwich here. The skirt on the outside, the bodice in between the two, and then on the very inside will be the skirt lining. And I'm just going to do the same thing again, where I sew in the round the lining to the bodice. Okay, so I'm going to make this all into one big unit, and then that will give us a clean finish once we flip everything right side out. Elvira is getting ready. She must be ready for dinner. She's making a little noise. Then we'll have a nice clean finish on that midriff seam. So let me pin all of this and then sew it, and then I'll flip it in and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so trim down that seam allowance. I'm not going to worry about serging these together or anything because it's going to be completely enclosed. And now it's going to be like magic when I turn the whole thing right side out and then put the skirt lining on the inside. What you're going to get is a beautiful finish on the inside, just completely clean finish with the lining. So let me turn it right side out for the front camera so you can see. But look how nice that finishes. You don't have any exposed seams on the inside. And it's a nice, beautiful, clean finish with the lining. So if you're doing a special occasion version, this might be the way to go. Okay, everyone, so here's my finished pink velvet wiggle dress, fully lined. I hope you love this project so much. I have to say we're freaking out here in the Charm Studio about how many wiggle dresses we want to make in both the slash neck version and this daring sweetheart version. So I hope you go crazy and make a ton for work, for play, for going out, experiencing your bohemian life. So I hope you love this project. I hope you love the whole new Patreon theme for this year. And do let us know how you like this new Joan Wiggle dress and how many you're planning to make. And we will see you next time. Goodbye.